Now, you can't talk about spinal manipulation without talking about what's that sound that we hear. As Sean mentioned before, going back to Roston, Wheeler, Haynes, they were the first to analyze what happens at a joint level. They didn't call it a cavitation, but they did notice that there was a bubble or a vapor cavity that was created. And then in 1971, we had Unsworth and colleagues. They were the one that first had the idea that I think this is a cavitation. From an engineering perspective, cavitation occurs when the pressure drops inside a liquid. And when that happens, a bubble's formed, and very quickly it collapses. And because of the speed and the pressure of that collapse, you can get a very big energy release, and that's where Unsworth suggested the sound is coming from. Now, the idea of the sound coming from the cavitation carried on for decades, and it wasn't until 2015 where we get work from Kawchuk and colleagues who basically did the same experiment as Unsworth, but they used cinematic MRI. The benefit of using cinematic MRI is you can look at the details of the bubble being created inside the joint. And what they found was that the pop sound occurred at the creation of the bubble, and the bubble actually stayed open for a few seconds and then collapsed. So this is different than what Unsworth was telling us in the 70s, where it's the collapse of the bubble making the sound. Here we had the first proof that the sound occurred just at the beginning of the creation of the bubble, not the collapse itself. And they call this tribonucleation. An important thing to note in this video is when the bones separate, you see a dark space form. And that dark space is the bubble, or the tribonucleation that's formed within the synovial fluid. After the viral video came out, the second author, Jerome Fryer, put out a new study that tried to give us a little more explanation on what's happening during the pop sound. He used a beaker water suction cup model where he put the suction cup into the water and pushed it against the side of a beaker. And what he's able to show that he can make a pop sound by pulling the suction cup away from the wall of the beaker, and he was also able to see the formation of a bubble, essentially the same thing they saw on cinematic MRI. He was also able to confirm when you pull the suction cup off and the bubble is formed, that's when the sound occurs. Now that bubble is remained for about 30 minutes. That 30-minute time matches well with refractory periods that we've seen in previous research done on real patients. When you adjust them, you can't make a pop sound again for another 30, 40, and sometimes over 90 minutes. It seems to vary on different people. One of the cool things that Fryer did was he wanted to see, could you change that amount of time? Can you change the refractory period and could you make it shorter? He did. What he did was when he pushed on the suction cup against the wall of the beaker, increasing the pressure inside the fluid, it reduced the time it took for that bubble to dissolve back into the fluid. After which was about 12 minutes, he could pull the suction cup again and make a new pop sound and a new bubble. If he tried to pull the suction cup away before the refractory period was done, you would take the bubble that was starting to get smaller and just make it bigger, but there would be no pop sound. Now, the one thing I think about when I think about this study is some of my patients come in and they say, "Doc, I've been feeling really cracky a lot nowadays and I can hear a lot of popping." And I like to tell them that's likely because there's more pressure on your joints, so you're hearing that pop more frequently. I sometimes use the analogy of when pulling the cap off a chapstick, which makes a pop sound. What happens there is there's a very rapid change in pressure, and that rapid change vibrates the air molecules between the cap and my ear. And inside my ear, that vibration moves the stereocilia in my ear, which sends an electrical signal to my brain, and my brain says, "Oh, I know that frequency, that's a pop sound." Now there's one more wrinkle to the pop sound. In 2018, Suja and Barakat, they did a mathematical model. And their mathematical model showed that the frequency, the sound that comes from a pop sound when somebody gets adjusted, is the same sound when a bubble collapses. It has the same frequency. So they're still suggesting the sound is coming from a collapse. Now I'm going to show you a video that demonstrates a cavitation. So you'll see a guy with a mallet hitting the top of a bottle filled with water, and that rapid drop of the bottle will drop the pressure inside the water, and you're going to see bubbles form and then collapse. Check out this video.
Cavitation in a beer bottle at 82,000 frames a second. When the mallet hits the top of the bottle, it causes the entire bottle to drop down with such inertia that the water is left behind. This sudden drop in pressure in concentrated areas causes the water to turn briefly to vapor, tearing open these voids called cavitation. And as soon as the water is able to overcome the low pressure of the cavitation bubbles, each bubble slams back closed, causing a very small point of intense heat and a shockwave powerful enough to smash the bottle open. Everything you saw between the hammer hitting the bottle and the glass cracking occurred in just 5 milliseconds.
All right, now I'm going to take you back, and I want you to pay attention. As soon as the hammer hits the top of the bottle, very tiny little bubbles open very, very quickly and close very quickly. Potentially, these could be making a sound. And then within milliseconds, you have the bigger bubbles being created at the bottom of the bubble, and then, of course, they collapse and you see the bubble crack. A neat thing to note about this video is it only takes 5 milliseconds. So you compare that to the 2015 Kochuk-Fryer video, where the bubble was held open for a few seconds. It's possible that there's small cavitations occurring at the beginning of that whole thing that you can't see on cinematic MRI. All right, to close out this section on the pop sound, I wanted to bring this back to your patients in the clinic. A lot of them come in, I know I have these patients, and they really want to hear the crack. So much so that they believe when they hear that crack sound, that's a successful adjustment. And there's been studies that suggest people do believe that. However, when they try to study, is there any change in clinical outcomes or are there any change in physiological outcomes, the evidence is pretty clear that there isn't. So a few studies. One looked at the changes in pupil diameter, which is a surrogate for what happens to the autonomic nervous system, and whether or not they heard a pop sound, there was no change in pupil diameter. Another study showed that when you're checking the sensitivity of the skin, the thermal sensitivity of the skin, whether or not a pop sound was heard, there was no change in sensitivity. The latest study in 2022 by Moorman and Newell compiled all the studies in this area, and the conclusions were the same. There's no evidence of improved pain outcomes associated with or without the pop sound. So it doesn't seem to matter in terms of clinical outcomes, and it doesn't seem to change any physiological outcomes. However, like I said before, you will have those patients where it matters a whole lot to them. And I've even had patients that came and they said, I've been looking for somebody to finally crack my neck, and I'm glad I found you.